Thank you very much, Professor Kibrik, and also let me thank the Institute of Linguistics of the Russian Academy of Sciences for organizing this excellent and very valuable first forum. I hope it will be the first of many, and that your development of the important questions of linguistics will continue to broaden into the various areas of society that our linguistic discipline can participate in. It's important, I think, to make a real impression in society, not just to make our academic work, but also to make our work relevant to help communities to improve their life. I'd like also to, on behalf of the Comité International Permanent des Linguistes, to thank you for coming and to hope that you will enjoy our joint conference, which will be, I think, the first of many. I bring greetings from Professor Frida Stors, who is the General Secretary of CIPL, and unfortunately she is not able to be here, but she has sent as her representative Professor Camille Hamans, who is among us and will be talking this afternoon about his important work on the small languages of the other part of Europe, not the Russian part of Europe, but the other part of Europe. And so you'll hear more about his work as well. What I'd like to do today, though, is to talk about some issues which I think we need to think about. And some of them are more linguistic, and some of them are less linguistic. So, where is the cursor? So, when we talk about language endangerment, we have to think about a number of issues. We have to think about some of the important issues that relate to non-linguistic questions. In particular, as you can see, I'll be talking a little bit about the importance of attitude and identity. Now, we just heard a lot from our introductory speakers about the identity and the importance of language, but I think we also need to think about the identity from the other perspective, that is, both from the perspective of the small group, but also from the perspective of the majority group. It's important both for the small group to have its own identity and for the large group to have its own identity, but the smaller groups, many of them, will also have the group identity of the larger group. That is, the nationalities of Russia are Russian, in addition to being whatever nationality they may themselves individually be. So, another important issue relates to the learning of language. And this is a choice that communities make. We need to be aware that we cannot force communities to do things that they do not want to do. So how do people choose to learn language? And when they know the language, when and where do they choose to use it? And I'll talk a little bit more about that. A third important non-linguistic issue relates to the external settings about language. What is the national policy? What are the local policies? What are the policies concerning different parts of the relevant issues? For example, what is the policy concerning language in education? What is the policy concerning the use of the mother tongue in the early stages of education? In UNESCO and UNICEF, they have had a long-term policy that says that mother tongue education is always best at the beginning, and that people who have mother tongue education at the beginning may actually learn the national language more effectively because they have started their education in a more congenial and effective way. Other setting factors, of course, there are many of these, and I'll talk about some of them. And then, lastly, what does the community want? Does it want to preserve its culture? Does it want to preserve its language? How important is the language as a component of the identity of the group? So we need to think not just of our narrow linguistic issues, but also about some of these other issues. So in particular, concerning attitudes, these are crucial. If people have a strong positive view of their group identity, and they think that the language is an important component of that identity, then the language will, of course, be more likely to persist, even if other things are less favorable. There may also be positive group identity. You may feel that you are an important a member of an ethnic group. You may feel that your ethnic group is important, but that your language is not such an important component of that. And there are some examples of that in Western Europe. For many years in Ireland, before 1922 when Ireland became independent, Irish language was not really a core identity component of being Irish, and so many people ceased to speak Irish. Since independence in 1922, Ireland has moved back to using its national language and to asserting its identity through its language. So these things can change. We do not have to give up just because at one point the attitudes are not good. We as linguists have contacts in communities. We can help communities to change their attitudes. We can use our skills as training facilitators to make language communities more aware of the importance of their language and more able to maintain their language by training them to do so. Concerning acquisition and use, well, we know that it's better to be bilingual. We all know that there are many studies which show that cognitively, bilingual people do better on many kinds of tasks. So this is why UNESCO and UNICEF advocate mother tongue education. It's not a deficit to start in one language and continue your education 1, 2, or 3 years later after a transition into a national language with another language. In fact, many studies by many scholars have found that once you learn 2 languages, when you are bilingual, then your third language is easier. So this is another good selling point. We can tell parents, oh yes, well, if you maintain your own language at home and your children come to school and learn Russian in school, then because they are bilingual, they will almost certainly find it easier to learn English, the world's most dangerous language, which I am speaking to you. So it's important to change people's attitudes, to not let them think that bilingualism is bad. We are linguists, we know it's good, but we have to change people's ideas about what is a good way to be bilingual. So you can learn a language, of course, most effectively in the home, from the community, from your relatives, but other paths are also possible. Sometimes much less effective, but the most important thing is once the language has been learned and is in use, it needs to be able to be used in all kinds of situations. So we need Facebook pages and internet material in languages that can support the maintenance and use of a language. It's important also to make sure that people are not ashamed to speak their language in the presence of speakers of other languages. So one of our introductory speakers gave us a wonderful poem which illustrates the fact that the language of the mother tongue, the language of the heart, is an important component of one's identity, of one's feelings about oneself and the world. So we have, as you can see in the bottom of this slide, just recently published a book with Cambridge University Press, not a commercial, which explains all these things in much more detail than I'm able to spend half an hour on now. The third major area of language-related external factors is policy. So we have, of course, in every country, at least one, usually only one, national language. There are a few exceptions. Singapore has 4, Switzerland has 4, India has 23, and other languages have more. But most countries have one national language, and the policy about that language is imposed by the government from the top. It usually favors one national language, and where there is provision for minority languages, this is an important support for those languages. Education is controlled by the government. Education is important for developing national unity and identity as members of a nation state, but also monolingual speakers may be disadvantaged because when they get to higher levels of employment, education, they may find that their mother tongue is no longer a help. It may be an impediment. So we need to be careful to have policies that are not too negative about the languages other than the national language. One issue that we need to think about for some languages, and I know this is an issue for some languages in Russia, that you have, if you have a writing system and orthography, then it's important that the orthography has to be owned by the community. The community has to be happy with that orthography, happy to use that orthography, not wanting to change it over and over again. And of course, in the 1920s and the 1930s, strange things happened in Russia. I won't talk about them, you know more about them than me, but it's happening again. In Kazakhstan, they recently decided to change from their Cyrillic script to a Roman script, and so orthographies can be changed top-down by governments. Sometimes this is a bad idea. It's not always good to change orthographies, but we need to respect what communities want and use an orthography in an effective way in an education setting. I've got a long list of other factors, I won't go into them in detail, but each of them is an important sociolinguistic issue. So demography, what is the population of a group? What is the age distribution of the population? What is the current status of that group with the government? For example, in Thailand, for the last 5 years with their current government, the government does not wish to compile statistics about anything concerning groups of any ethnicity at all in Thailand. So there are no recent statistics. In countries like China, there are, as you know, 56 national groups, and of these 56 groups, there's one majority group, the Chinese, and 55 national minorities, and all of the statistics about demography are related to these specific categories. Now, sometimes, as we know as linguists, the categories of a government may not correspond exactly to the categories of language and dialect that we are aware of ourselves. Similarly, for geography, in many countries in the world, we have a policy that says, these people live here, this is their land, they have the right to live in this land. In Australia, we have approximately 40% of the country, which is reserved now and has been granted to Aboriginal communities for their exclusive use. And they have, unlike us, the right to exclude people from this territory. So for example, if a mining company wants to mine for gold in my backyard, they have the perfect right to come. But if a mining company wants to mine on Aboriginal land, they need the agreement of the community. So geography is an important component of what you have as a means of strengthening your identity. Not only geography in the sense of territory, but in the sense of how concentrated you are, how widely distributed you are, whether you have, for example, a diaspora in other places, which can be a support. So you might have a diaspora outside the territory, which is economically more advanced and able to send money back to support people who live at home. It's important to have a full idea of the distribution of a language geographically as well as demographically. Similarly, economy. Well, we know that people are more interested in having a good economic life with good education for their children and good health than they are in speaking their language. This is just a reality. So we need to assure communities that they will have a good, solid economic basis to continue to have a good lifestyle using their language without having, for example, to go and work in cities that do not support that community language. In culture, this is one of the broadest, from religion to material culture, which is what this museum is about, and all kinds of other cultural questions. How strong is kinship? What kinds of marriage rules do you have? Do you have to marry within the community? Is it okay to marry somebody from one other particular community, and therefore your community is likely to be bilingual in that language as well? And so on. Education, as I've said, is one of the crucial external factors. Whether the language is supported in the school, and whether the language is supported in other ways through education, for example, of children by elders outside the school into normal cultural settings. So how do we deal with these problems? Well, I've, over the last 10 years, been thinking and developing a model which uses the principles of resilience thinking. Resilience thinking is a model developed by a number of ecologists to look at settings where the social and other geographical changes have led to environmental degradation. And in these settings, the ecologists look for what the factors are that have led to this degradation and try to change them, ameliorate them, or adapt the environment so that it can recover from that environmental degradation. So in the same way, I think by looking at the sociolinguistic factors that I've talked about in the setting of an individual language and its community, we can see what are the factors that have contributed to the language shift, if there is one, and what are the factors that may be under the community's control to change. Can they get their language back into school? Can they retrieve the positive identity that their grandfathers and great-grandfathers had 50 or 100 or 200 years ago? Can they recover some of the cultural traditions which are preserved in museums in many cases, which people may go to and get the information to get a real authentic version of their culture back after they have lost it through various kinds of external pressure. So we can strive for a new equilibrium in which the people who come to realize that they wish to maintain their language can be helped to bring that language back. Now, the next part of my talk will be talking about how they do that. So what communities can do is sometimes not very much. It's sometimes difficult because if there are no living speakers of a language at all, and we as linguists have failed in our duty to document that language properly, then it may be very difficult to provide good language assistance to such a community. So another thing is, communities will often say, we want everybody to speak our language all the time in our community. And that may not always be realistic in a community, for example, where half of the population is not a member of that ethnic group, where it's a mixed community. We need to have realistic goals and not set goals which will be unable to be achieved and people would then become disappointed. We need to work step by step, probably starting with fairly small steps towards achieving resilience for that language in its community. We need to have, we as linguists, I think, have an important role to play, but we're not the only ones. We need to bring the community with us. They need to change their view about language so that they are aware that they can keep it, that they don't have to let it go, that it's not possible to be only monolingual. It's better to be bilingual. So how do you do this? Well, a lot of different ways have been tried. The best way, as I said before, under acquisition and use, is to have people learn the language from their family in the home. If this is not possible, there's another way, a really sneaky way, which actually is a result of economic change. That is, children are left behind in the village with their grandparents while their parents are off in some city somewhere working. This is an enormous problem at some levels in China, where none of the villages in remote areas have enough people to do the agricultural work. But it's economically supportive in the sense that it makes the community able to bring a lot of money back from the city and come back from the city every 6 months for the important holidays in China. And it also leaves the children with the grandparents. So the grandparents are the secret weapon, I think, for language maintenance. They can be speaking the language with the children learn the language in the home in a natural way because the parents, who may not be very fluent, are gone. So this is another strategy. Now, in the language nest, a situation in which an older fluent speaker is tasked with caring for children aged 4, 5, 6 before they enter school. The language nest was first developed in New Zealand, and has since spread worldwide. These are preschool programs to develop language in infants whose parents may not speak the language, but whose elders do, and who can be brought into the school, as long as the school system is a little bit flexible. You don't want to have some kind of Ministry of Education saying, yes, well, this grandmother is really very lively, but she doesn't have a teacher's degree, so we can't let her into the school. I think we need to break down that kind of restriction and make sure that grandparents do get the access to make children able to learn their language and to learn also many aspects of their culture. Some other ways you can put it in the school, but that's not the best way. To learn a language in a school, in a written form, without much conversation, without much to read, is really not very effective. So if you're going to have a school program, it has to also be something that works in the community, that generates people's interest sufficient to want to learn the language, and then to have the materials that they can use. For example, published materials of folklore and songs and other cultural material of great interest to communities. The Master and Apprentice program, this was originated in California by Leanne Hinton, in which you basically put an old fluent person together with a young enthusiastic person, usually 2 generations younger, who is the apprentice, and they just work together to develop language competence in the apprentice. And then usually the apprentice becomes a language teacher in the community. Or you can just have signs and other kinds of symbolic use. In Australia, there are a lot of signs in Aboriginal languages that are no longer spoken. In Canberra, you go to any place in Canberra, you see a sign that this is the traditional territory of the local Aboriginal community in Melbourne and so on. This is important. This is something that gives people positive attitudes about their language, but you cannot just have symbolic use, I think. Now, in looking at how to go about reversing language shift, we need to be aware that not all of the languages are in the same situation. So some languages are much further along the path of language shift. Some languages are still spoken in some areas, but just disappearing in others. I think we need to be careful not to use the wrong metaphors. 30 years ago, people talked about language death. We don't do that anymore. We have a more positive view. UNESCO, for example, uses the term languages in danger of disappearing. It's a bit long, but it's certainly a much less negative thing than dying languages. Furthermore, we can't always speak of what we want to do with the community to reverse language shift as revitalization, because some languages are no longer spoken at all. You can't revitalize something that's not spoken. It's not the same kind of process. Maintenance similarly implies that you're maintaining something. Now, maintenance also suggests we have a goal, we have a standard, we're going to try and keep people speaking the way they used to speak. And that's always problematic because, as we know, every language changes. We cannot force young people to speak the same as their parents or grandparents. So similarly, even in a language endangerment situation, you need to be aware that you have to allow young people to speak in ways that they find appropriate. In many Australian language programs, they have found that you cannot impose the full, fabulous, amazing morphological system that existed 50 or 100 years ago. You cannot make people speak the way Bob Dixon described the Turbo language. They just don't do it that way. No longer spoken in that way. So you have modern versions of languages, and if these languages are what people actually speak, then this is what you have to maintain, not force people to go back to something from 100 years ago. So I won't have time to talk about all of these, but you can find various publications about this on academia.edu. I'm sure you're all familiar with that. On the one hand is the possibility the language is still spoken. You have the possibility, to have full revitalization using the resources of fluent speakers who can help you to revive that language. That's a very good possibility. And that's happened in a lot of countries around the world in the last 20, 30 years. Revival is harder. The language is no longer spoken, sometimes has not been spoken for some time, and you may have materials, if the linguists have been assiduous 20, 50, 100 years ago, to help communities to revive their languages. And this is the case, for example, for some languages in Australia. The Kaurna language of Adelaide has been revived using materials collected by German missionaries in the 1840s, which were then analyzed by a linguist, Rob Amory, in conjunction with members of the community who chose about 20 years ago to want to revive their language. And 2 children are now being brought up bilingual in a household which uses Kaurna as the main means of communication. So languages can be revived even if they're completely gone. You can have a language like Hebrew, which had a literary version widespread and widely used throughout the community for several thousand years after the language ceased to be a spoken language of everyday use. Now, there are many views about the status of Hebrew. The view that most people take is that modern Hebrew is a language which is the modern version of Hebrew. It has been renativized and spread into general use. There are other views which claim that it's re-lexified Yiddish, Zuckerman. I think that's a pretty strange idea, but some people support other views. Then you have another strategy, which is go and create a new language. Combine elements of 2 or more languages into a new language. The most usual form of this is, of course, creolization. But it's also possible to go direct from bilingualism to creating a new language which is a combination of 2. For example, the Michif language in northwestern Canada is a combination basically of French noun phrases and Cree verbal and other structure. So the whole sentence is in 2 languages. All the nouns are in French with gender and agreement and articles, le, la, the whole business. And all the verbs and the rest of the sentence is all in Cree with its amazing and complex verb morphology. So you need to be bilingual to create a nativized language. You can't be monolingual in one language and know a little bit of the other. Denativization, perhaps I'll talk a little bit about this because I want to show you some examples, is where you create a new language that's trying to unify a number of distinct varieties to form a new focus for a group which has diversified in a dialectal way. Now I'll just skip a few slides which I have exemplified more about the others and talk about denativization. Lisu, the language that Maya and I are currently working on, is a language spoken in 4 countries with a denativized literary standard, originally created by Christian missionaries and their Lisu converts about 100 years ago, and it has now taken off as the literary version of the language used by people who don't speak that at all. It is distinct from all of the spoken varieties. It has a simplified evidential system. It has a relatively simple phonology compared to many of the real spoken varieties. So it's a kind of lowest common denominator language, which is effective because it's easy for speakers of all the different varieties of Lisu to learn. Another less successful example is Romansh in southeastern Switzerland, where the government said, okay, we have Romansh as a national language. It's one of the 4 national languages of Switzerland. We have to have one version of this language that we can put on the banknotes and the trains and the telephone book and so on. So they created one. They employed a German-speaking Romance linguist to create a standard language for this set of 5 literary varieties of Romansh, which the speakers hate. It was introduced in schools. It led to children being taught in a language which they couldn't speak to their grandparents. The grandparents didn't understand when the children spoke to them in this artificial standard Romansh. So we have to be careful not to do things that communities don't like. So just to give you a very brief example of, let's see, where is it? How you can help a community. Well, you can do things that are helpful to them externally. You can create a Unicode for their orthography, which we have done. You can publish materials for them, which we have done, like this dictionary. You can publish various kinds of heritage materials. This is the traditional Lisu New Year song. You can see the orthography up there. Looks pretty Roman, doesn't it? Except, what do you see? Some of the letters are upside down. They have 40 letters, 15 alphabet letters upside down and 25 right side up. They all have consistent phonetic values. The things after the syllables are tones. The vowel A is not written. So in a sense, this is like a Devanagari type orthography written with Roman letters. So it's not really a Romanization. So we have to be careful to use the things that the community want. We train people. We've trained Lisu people up to the level of PhD to be facilitators, language brokers, workers, to raise the ideas about language and the importance of language within the community. We support a number of Lisu community organizations. There's a website, the Lisu Cultural Center in Chiang Mai has a website, molatsu.com. Impact, which was an NGO set up by a Dutch anthropologist, Intermountain People's Education and Culture in Thailand Association. We work with a number of universities in Thailand. We just visited a couple of them last week. We work with a number of universities in China. We visit them fairly regularly. All of these organizations are helping to develop positive ideas about language and positive things that people can do to maintain their language. So we are the people who can do this. We can help people with language. We're the language professionals. We have the materials. We can train people. But we are not the people to decide. They have to decide. They have to say, okay, we want you to come and help us to revitalize, or to revive, or to do some other form of reclamation appropriate for the level of language in the community at that time. We cannot tell people what to do, but we can help them, and we should, I think. This is our duty, to help them to do this important work. Thank you.
Dear colleagues, we're a bit behind the schedule, but let's have one or two questions. So I have one question. I'm familiar with a community where when people are asked whether they would like to maintain their language, they almost unanimously say yes. But when it comes to practical efforts, then it's very hard to have anything done. What do you think the linguists can do in this kind of situation?
You're quite right, Professor Kubik. There's often a mismatch between what people say they want and what is actually achievable. And so it's important in such a situation to make people aware that they can be as positive as they want, but they have to actually do something. Each individual has to do something. They have to decide, okay, we're going to use the language to go to the village, to the fields to work together. We need to make sure that communities make realistic decisions. And I think this is something that will come if you show a community that their language is interesting, important, possible to learn, possible to develop, and important for their identity. So I think it's really not our job to tell people that, no, they shouldn't do that. We must say, okay, yes, we want you to think positive, and we want to help you, and we want you to do, maybe try this. Try having your grandmother take the children out into the forest to look at plants, to learn about traditional medicine. have the grandfather take the children out by the river to learn how to fish, or whatever it is, some traditional skills that can be conducted in the language. So start small, and don't just wait for the community to be, all coming up and jumping up and down to want to learn in the school, which is not a very good place to learn.
Okay, last question, please.
So I would like to ask about the language nest.
Yes.
Can the language nest be effective if the teacher is his mother tongue through his parents, but the first language was the Russian one?
I think the answer is yes. You can have a language nest with a teacher, and as I said, not necessarily a fully qualified teacher. A person who is a member of the community, who is enthusiastic about the language. And for example, I talked about the master and apprentice scheme. One of the goals of the master and apprentice scheme is to have these apprentices able to go into schools and be the leader, the language leader in a language nest. So I think it is possible to have a second language learner of a traditional language as the teacher in a language nest. As long as they are positive about the language, it's not something that they're doing because it's a job. It really has to be something that they feel in their head is important.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Professor Bрэдли, for a presentation.